Sometimes the loneliest person in a crowded room is the one everyone assumes does not belong there. Snow swirled through the streets of Manhattan as evening settled over the city, coating Fifth Avenue in silver light and reflections from passing taxis. Inside the Grand Wellington, one of New York City's most prestigious restaurants, warmth, elegance, and quiet ambition filled the air. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light across polished marble floors. Investors discussed mergers over expensive wine. Soft jazz drifted through the dining room while servers moved gracefully between tables dressed in immaculate uniforms. Among them was Emily Parker. At 34 years old, Emily had worked at the Grand Wellington for nearly 4 years. Most guests remembered her because she listened carefully and treated every customer with the same gentle respect, whether they arrived in designer suits or winter coats worn thin by years of use. On this particular evening, Emily noticed something unusual the moment an older man entered the restaurant alone. He wore a simple charcoal overcoat, slightly outdated but meticulously clean. His silver hair was neatly combed, and he carried himself with quiet dignity. Yet several guests barely concealed their annoyance when he approached the hostess stand. "Reservation for Takahashi," he said softly in heavily accented English. The hostess glanced at her screen. "Yes, Mr. Takahashi. Your guests have already arrived." The man nodded politely. "Thank you very much." As he followed the hostess toward a private dining room, 2 businessmen seated nearby exchanged amused glances. "That meeting must not be very important if they sent someone's grandfather," one whispered loudly enough for others to hear. A few people chuckled. The older man gave no indication that he had heard them, but Emily noticed the nearly invisible pause in his steps before he continued walking. Something about that moment stayed with her. 20 minutes later, Emily was assigned to serve the private dining room. Inside sat 4 American investors dressed in tailored suits. At the head of the table sat the older gentleman. Papers, presentation materials, and financial reports covered the polished mahogany surface. The atmosphere felt tense. "Good evening," Emily said warmly while pouring water. "Can I bring anyone coffee or tea?" The American investors barely acknowledged her presence. The older gentleman looked directly at her and offered a small bow from his seat. "Green tea, please," he said politely. "Of course, sir," Emily replied with a smile. As she walked away, one investor sighed impatiently. "I hope your interpreter arrives soon, Mr. Takahashi. We cannot afford communication problems tonight." Mr. Takahashi lowered his eyes briefly. "He should arrive shortly." Snow delayed flights. Another executive checked his watch. "This partnership affects nearly $300 million. We really need efficiency." Emily returned several minutes later carrying a traditional ceramic teapot reserved for special guests. As she gently placed the tea before Mr. Takahashi, she noticed something unexpected. Resting beside his documents was a worn leather notebook filled entirely with handwritten Japanese calligraphy. Mr. Takahashi carefully thanked her before returning his attention to the increasingly uneasy discussion around the table. Throughout the next hour, Emily passed the room repeatedly while serving other guests. Each time, she sensed growing discomfort. The snowstorm outside intensified as evening deepened across Manhattan. Thick white flakes swept past the tall windows of the Grand Wellington, softening the city lights beyond and turning Fifth Avenue into a river of glowing headlights and reflections. Inside the private dining room, however, the atmosphere continued growing colder. Emily Parker entered quietly carrying fresh tea and a tray of appetizers. The moment she stepped inside, she sensed the tension immediately. One of the American investors had removed his jacket and loosened his tie. Another repeatedly checked his watch. Kenji Takahashi sat perfectly composed, his hands folded neatly atop a leather portfolio, but Emily noticed the subtle signs of concern in his expression. The empty chair reserved for the interpreter remained untouched. "Mr. Takahashi, we have been waiting nearly 90 minutes, one investor said, trying unsuccessfully to hide his frustration. "Our schedule cannot continue like this. Kenji offered a respectful nod. I sincerely apologize. The weather situation is unfortunate. My interpreter's flight remains delayed. Another executive sighed heavily. Could we perhaps continue tomorrow? Silence settled over the room. Kenji lowered his eyes briefly. Tomorrow, I return to Tokyo. The executives exchanged uneasy looks. Emily gently placed a cup of fresh green tea beside Kenji. Your tea, sir, she said softly. Kenji looked up and smiled politely. Thank you very much, Miss Parker. Emily returned the smile before quietly leaving the room. Throughout the next 30 minutes, she continued serving nearby tables, yet she found herself repeatedly glancing toward the private dining room. Each time she passed, the atmosphere appeared more strained. At one point, she overheard one executive speaking near the hallway. Honestly, this entire arrangement feels disorganized, the man whispered to his colleague. How can someone negotiate a deal this large without speaking fluent English? His colleague shrugged. I suppose that is why wealthy people hire staff. Neither man realized Kenji had quietly stepped into the hallway moments earlier and had almost certainly heard every word. He simply bowed slightly as they passed and returned to the meeting room without comment. Emily watched from across the restaurant. Something inside her heart tightened. 20 minutes later, she brought dessert menus to the table. The conversation had slowed almost completely. Financial documents remained spread across the polished mahogany surface, but nobody seemed certain how to proceed. One executive finally closed his folder. Perhaps we should postpone until proper translation services become available. For the first time all evening, disappointment became visible on Kenji's face. It lasted only a second, but Emily saw it clearly. He nodded respectfully. I understand. As Emily collected empty cups, she noticed the leather notebook again. One page had fallen open. Elegant Japanese calligraphy filled the paper in flowing black ink. Without thinking, Emily paused. The final handwritten line read, "Even distant snow carries memories of home." Her eyes softened instantly. She carefully closed the notebook before anyone noticed she had seen it. When she returned to the kitchen, her coworker Melissa shook her head. Poor guy, she whispered. Nobody seems interested in listening to him. Emily looked toward the private dining room. I think they would listen if they understood him. Melissa laughed lightly. Maybe. But tonight does not seem very promising. Emily said nothing. Instead, she looked once more through the glass doorway. Kenji now sat alone while the executive stepped outside to take phone calls. He held his teacup with both hands, gazing silently through the window at the falling snow. In that moment, despite the luxurious surroundings, he looked less like one of the world's most successful businessmen and more like a traveler impossibly far from home. Emily quietly returned to work. Yet deep inside, memories she had not visited in years had already begun awakening. By 7:30 that evening, the snowstorm had become one of the worst New York had seen all winter. News reports playing quietly above the bar announced widespread flight cancellations, traffic gridlock, and airport closures throughout the Northeast. Inside the Grand Wellington, however, the private dining room remained occupied. The American investors had reluctantly agreed to continue waiting, but patience was rapidly disappearing. Emily Parker carried another pot of freshly brewed coffee toward the room just as raised voices drifted through the partially open doorway. Mr. Takahashi, with all due respect, we cannot continue discussing a partnership if we cannot fully understand each other, one executive said firmly. Another nodded in agreement. This agreement involves manufacturing facilities across 3 continents. Miscommunication at this stage could be disastrous. Kenji Takahashi listened quietly. His expression remained calm, but Emily noticed the fatigue in his eyes. He had spent nearly 3 hours attempting to bridge a gap that seemed to widen with every passing minute. I understand your concerns, Kenji said carefully in English. Perhaps I have not explained our long-term vision clearly enough. He opened a presentation folder and slowly searched for the right words. In Japanese business culture, trust comes before profit. We believe. He paused. The precise English phrase seemed to escape him. Silence settled across the room. One investor leaned back in his chair and rubbed his forehead. This is exactly the problem, he muttered quietly. Emily stepped inside carrying the coffee service. As she poured fresh cups, she noticed something unusual. Kenji's presentation materials included handwritten notes in both English and Japanese. Several pages contained detailed observations about American business customs. Others contained careful translations. It was immediately obvious that Kenji had spent countless hours preparing for this meeting. He had not arrived unprepared. He had arrived alone. As Emily finished serving, Kenji's phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen and quietly excused himself. Moments later, Emily saw him standing alone near the restaurant entrance speaking softly into the phone in Japanese. Although she could not hear every word, disappointment was unmistakable in his voice. When he returned to the dining room several minutes later, his expression had changed. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said respectfully, "I regret to inform you that my interpreter cannot arrive tonight. All flights from Chicago have been cancelled." The room became completely silent. One executive slowly closed his notebook. Another looked toward the snow-covered windows. "Then we should reschedule," someone finally said. Kenji nodded politely, but this time his disappointment was impossible to hide. "Unfortunately, tomorrow morning I must return to Tokyo. My company begins negotiations in Singapore in 2 days." Another silence followed. $300 million suddenly seemed to be slipping away because of weather and language. Emily watched from the service station across the room. She saw the investors exchanging uncertain glances. She saw Kenji carefully gathering his papers with the quiet resignation of someone accustomed to disappointment. Then she saw something else. As Kenji placed documents into his leather portfolio, a small photograph slipped onto the floor unnoticed. Emily quickly approached and picked it up. The picture showed a much younger Kenji standing beneath cherry blossoms beside an elderly woman. Written beneath the photograph in elegant Japanese characters was a single sentence. "Home is where someone understands your heart." Emily stared at the words for only a second before carefully returning the photograph. When she handed it to him, Kenji looked genuinely surprised. "Thank you," he said softly. Their eyes met briefly. In that moment, memories flooded back to Emily with startling clarity. Spring mornings in Kyoto. Her father teaching at the university. Long afternoons practicing formal Japanese. Tea ceremonies. Cherry blossoms drifting through ancient temple gardens. A language she had not spoken aloud in nearly 10 years suddenly echoed inside her mind as naturally as breathing. Emily stood perfectly still. Across the room, the investors had already begun discussing future scheduling. The opportunity was disappearing minute by minute. Emily looked once more at the tired Japanese businessman sitting alone at the head of the table. Then, for the first time in years, she made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. Emily Parker stood beside the service station, her heart beating faster than it had in years. Around her, the Grand Wellington continued operating with polished precision. Glasses clinked softly. Jazz music floated through the dining room. Guests laughed over expensive dinners, unaware that only a few feet away, a partnership worth hundreds of millions of dollars was quietly collapsing. Emily looked once more toward the private dining room. The investors were already organizing their papers. One man had begun putting on his coat. Kenji Takahashi sat silently at the head of the table, carefully arranging documents inside his leather portfolio with the same dignity he had carried all evening. He had accepted disappointment with grace. Somehow, that made it even harder to watch. Emily took a slow breath. Then she walked toward the room. She paused briefly at the doorway. Every instinct told her to remain silent. After all, she was only a waitress. No one expected anything more from her. Yet another voice, one she had not listened to in years, quietly reminded her of Kyoto mornings, university lecture halls, and her father's gentle insistence that language existed not merely to communicate, but to honor another person's humanity. Emily stepped inside carrying a fresh pot of tea. "Excuse me," she said softly. The conversation immediately stopped. Emily carefully refilled Kenji's teacup before placing the pot on the table. Then, without warning, she looked directly at him and spoke. "Takahashi-sama, moshi yoke riba, watashi ni otatsudai sasit itadakimasen ka." If you wish, I would be honored to assist. Complete silence filled the room. One investor froze while reaching for his briefcase. Another slowly lowered his reading glasses. Kenji stared at Emily as though he had misheard her. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Kenji spoke quietly in Japanese. "Anata wa Nihongo o hanasemasu ka?" You speak Japanese? Emily offered a small respectful bow. "Hi. Sukashi dake dua arimasen." Yes. More than a little. The expression on Kenji's face changed completely. The loneliness Emily had seen throughout the evening seemed to disappear instantly, replaced by astonishment and something deeper. Relief. "Where did you learn such Japanese?" he asked, now speaking entirely in his native language. Emily smiled gently. "My father taught comparative literature at Kyoto University. We lived there for almost 8 years." Across the table, the American investors looked utterly bewildered. One finally leaned toward another and whispered, "What just happened?" Kenji turned toward them, his voice stronger than at any point that evening. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said in English, "it appears we may continue after all." The room remained stunned. Emily immediately raised her hand slightly. "Only if everyone is comfortable with that arrangement," she said politely. The investors quickly agreed. Within minutes, the atmosphere inside the room transformed completely. Emily sat quietly beside the presentation screen, translating with remarkable precision. Yet she did more than translate words. When Kenji described his company's philosophy, Emily carefully explained cultural nuances that direct translation alone would have missed. When investors asked difficult questions, she conveyed not only language but tone, preserving respect on both sides. The conversation began flowing naturally for the first time all evening. Questions became discussions. Discussions became possibilities. Even the investors who had previously appeared impatient now listened attentively. Several times, Kenji looked toward Emily with visible gratitude. Nearly 2 hours later, the final presentation slide disappeared from the screen. Silence settled across the room once again, but this time it felt entirely different. One investor slowly closed his notebook and smiled. "Mr. Takahashi," he said, "I believe we have the foundation for something extraordinary." Another extended his hand across the table. Kenji accepted it warmly. Emily quietly gathered empty teacups, intending to leave unnoticed. Before she reached the door, however, Kenji rose from his chair. "Miss Parker," he said softly. The entire room turned toward her. Kenji bowed deeply, a gesture so formal and sincere that every conversation in the surrounding dining area seemed to stop. "Tonight," he said, "you gave me far more than translation. You allowed me to be understood." For several seconds after Kenji Takahashi bowed, the entire private dining room remained silent. Even the investors who had spent the evening focused solely on numbers seemed moved by the sincerity of the gesture. Emily Parker felt warmth rise to her face. She had never expected recognition. In truth, she had only wanted to help someone who looked profoundly alone. "I was happy to assist," she replied softly. Kenji straightened slowly. "Nevertheless, I am deeply grateful." One of the investors laughed gently as the tension that had dominated the evening finally dissolved. "Miss Parker," he said, "you may have just saved all of us several months of negotiations." Another executive nodded. And possibly several $100 million. Emily smiled politely but quickly excused herself. There were still tables to serve, orders to deliver, and desserts waiting in the kitchen. Within minutes, she had returned to carrying trays and refilling water glasses as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet throughout the remainder of the evening, whispers followed her through the restaurant. Employees who had witnessed the astonishing exchange could hardly believe what they had seen. Melissa intercepted Emily near the kitchen entrance. "Since when do you speak Japanese like that?" she whispered, still stunned. Emily laughed quietly. "A long time ago. You never mentioned it." Emily adjusted the plates on her tray. Most people never asked. Shortly before 10 o'clock, the business meeting finally concluded. The investors departed in noticeably better spirits than when they had arrived. Several shook Kenji's hand warmly before leaving. Snow still drifted gently beyond the restaurant windows, but inside the Grand Wellington, the atmosphere felt transformed. As Emily cleared the final dishes from the private dining room, she noticed Kenji remained seated alone. The documents had been packed away. Only the ceramic teapot and his leather notebook remained on the table. "May I bring you anything else, Mr. Takahashi?" Emily asked. Kenji looked up and smiled warmly. "Only your company for a few moments, if your schedule allows." Emily hesitated briefly before taking a seat across from him. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Kenji carefully opened his notebook. "These poems," he said, gently touching the handwritten pages, "belong to my mother." Emily looked at the elegant calligraphy. "They are beautiful." Kenji nodded. "My mother believed poetry preserved memories." He smiled faintly. "I carry this notebook whenever I travel. It reminds me where I come from." Emily studied the carefully inked characters. "My father felt the same way." Kenji looked surprised. "Your father taught in Kyoto?" Emily nodded. "Comparative literature. We moved there when I was 12. I remained until graduate school." "Graduate school?" Kenji asked with visible curiosity. Emily smiled softly. "Columbia University. Japanese Linguistics and Intercultural Communication." Kenji stared at her in astonishment. "Then why are you working here?" The question was simple, yet Emily grew quiet. She looked toward the snow-covered windows. "My mother became ill several years ago," she said softly. "Alzheimer's disease." Kenji listened silently. "After my father passed away, there was no one else to care for her. I left my doctoral program and began working full-time." She smiled gently. "Life rarely follows the plans we make." For a long moment, Kenji said nothing. Finally, he spoke quietly in Japanese. "Kazoku no tame no jisei wa keshite muda ni narimasen." Sacrifices made for family are never wasted. Emily lowered her eyes. It had been many years since anyone had spoken those words to her. "Thank you," she whispered in Japanese. At that moment, the restaurant manager approached the table looking bewildered. "Emily, I had no idea you possessed these skills." Emily stood immediately. "I am sorry if I overstepped." The manager quickly shook his head. "Quite the opposite. Several guests have already complimented how professionally the situation was handled." After the manager left, Kenji slowly rose from his seat. "Miss Parker," he said, "this evening you reminded me of something important." Emily looked at him curiously. Kenji smiled. "Sometimes, the most remarkable people are hiding in plain sight." As Emily watched him leave the Grand Wellington and disappear into the falling snow, she could not have known that their conversation was only the beginning. The following Tuesday, Emily Parker arrived at the Grand Wellington for her evening shift expecting an ordinary night. Manhattan had finally emerged from the snowstorm, and the city buzzed with its usual relentless energy. Inside the restaurant, reservations were fully booked, the dining room glowed beneath crystal chandeliers, and servers hurried between tables preparing for another busy evening. Emily had almost convinced herself that the remarkable events of several nights earlier had simply become a beautiful memory. Then, shortly after 6 o'clock, the hostess approached her with an expression of unmistakable surprise. "Emily," she whispered, "there is someone asking specifically for you." Emily looked toward the entrance. Standing beside the hostess was Kenji Takahashi. Unlike their first meeting, he was not accompanied by investors, assistants, or business associates. He wore a simple dark wool coat and carried a small package wrapped carefully in traditional Japanese paper. The moment he saw Emily, he offered the same respectful bow she remembered from Kyoto. "Good evening, Miss Parker," he said warmly. Emily smiled, genuinely pleased to see him. "Mr. Takahashi. Welcome back." Kenji's eyes reflected quiet amusement. "This time, I hope to enjoy dinner without causing an international business crisis." Emily laughed softly. "That sounds much less stressful." Kenji requested a table in a quiet corner overlooking the city. Throughout the evening, Emily served him as she would any guest, yet their conversations gradually extended beyond menu recommendations and tea selections. Kenji asked about her mother. Emily explained that her mother's condition varied from week to week but that familiar routine still brought comfort. In return, Kenji spoke about Tokyo, his grandchildren, and the loneliness that often accompanied international business travel. "People assume wealth protects you from loneliness," he said quietly while looking through the window at the city lights. "In reality, it sometimes creates more distance." Emily understood immediately. "My father used to say that titles introduce us, but kindness allows people to know us." Kenji smiled thoughtfully. "Your father sounds like a wise man." Near the end of the meal, Kenji placed the carefully wrapped package on the table. "May I ask you to accept this?" Emily looked uncertain. "Mr. Takahashi, that is not necessary." "Please," Kenji said gently. "In Japan, gratitude should be expressed properly." Emily slowly unwrapped the package. Inside rested a beautifully handcrafted fountain pen made from dark lacquered wood. Delicate cherry blossoms had been engraved along its surface. Beneath it lay a handwritten note in elegant Japanese calligraphy. A language becomes meaningful only when it brings people together. Emily stared silently at the words. "It is beautiful," she whispered. Kenji nodded. "It belonged to a close friend who believed deeply in cultural understanding. I believe he would want you to have it." Emily carefully closed the box. "Thank you. I will treasure it." Before leaving, Kenji hesitated. "Miss Parker, I realize this may be unusual, but tomorrow afternoon I will visit the Japanese garden at Brooklyn Botanic Garden before returning to Tokyo. If your schedule permits, I would be honored if you joined me for tea." Emily was surprised by the invitation. Yet something about Kenji's sincerity reminded her of the professors, neighbors, and elderly shopkeepers who had shaped her years in Kyoto. "I would like that," she said softly. The following afternoon, beneath blooming early spring trees and the quiet sound of flowing water, two people from entirely different worlds sat together sharing traditional tea in the middle of New York City. Neither realized that their unlikely friendship had already begun changing both of their lives in ways neither had anticipated. The Brooklyn Botanic Garden welcomed spring quietly. Soft sunlight filtered through delicate cherry blossoms, and a gentle breeze carried the faint scent of fresh rain and flowering trees across winding stone paths. For Emily Parker, stepping through the Japanese hill and pond garden felt strangely familiar, almost as though she had crossed an ocean rather than a city. Memories returned immediately. The sound of distant water. The stillness. The unspoken understanding that silence itself could be meaningful. Kenji Takahashi was already waiting beside a traditional wooden pavilion overlooking the koi pond. He stood with his hands folded calmly in front of him, dressed in a simple dark suit rather than the formal business attire Emily had expected. When he saw her approaching, he smiled warmly. "Miss Parker," he said. "Thank you for coming." Emily returned his smile. Thank you for inviting me. They spent the next hour walking slowly through the gardens. Their conversation flowed naturally between English and Japanese, shifting effortlessly from literature to travel, family traditions, and favorite childhood memories. For the first time since returning to America years earlier, Emily found herself speaking Japanese without hesitation or effort. It felt like rediscovering a forgotten part of herself. Eventually, they settled beneath blooming cherry trees while tea was served in delicate ceramic cups. For several moments, neither spoke. They simply listened to the wind moving through the branches overhead. Finally, Kenji broke the silence. You miss Japan very much, do you not? Emily looked down at her teacup. Every day, she admitted softly. Especially Kyoto. She smiled faintly. When my father accepted his position there, I was angry. I did not want to leave New York. She laughed quietly. By the time we returned, Kyoto had become home. Kenji nodded knowingly. Home is rarely a place. Usually, it is people. Emily's expression softened. I think that is true. She looked toward the pond. After my father passed away, everything changed. My mother's health declined quickly. Graduate school became impossible. Kenji listened silently. At first, I believed I was sacrificing my future, Emily continued. But eventually I realized something important. Caring for someone you love is not losing your future. It is simply choosing a different one. Kenji remained quiet for several seconds. Then he spoke softly. My wife died 12 years ago. Emily looked at him with surprise. Throughout their conversations, he had never mentioned his personal life. Kenji gazed across the water. We were married for 36 years. After she passed away, I buried myself in business. Everyone praised my success. He smiled sadly. No one noticed I had forgotten how to live. Emily said nothing. She understood that some grief required silence rather than advice. My grandchildren often tell me that I work too much, Kenji continued. Perhaps they are correct. Emily smiled gently. Children and grandchildren are usually wiser than adults believe. Kenji laughed softly. That appears to be universally true. As afternoon sunlight began fading, they walked toward the garden exit. Near the gate, they passed a group of university students speaking fluent Japanese while discussing research projects. Emily slowed almost imperceptibly. Kenji noticed immediately. You miss academic life, he said. Quietly. Emily hesitated. Sometimes. Only sometimes, he asked. Emily smiled wistfully. Every day. Kenji studied her thoughtfully but asked nothing further. Later that evening, after returning home to the small apartment she shared with her mother, Emily discovered an envelope waiting beneath her door. Inside was a handwritten note in elegant Japanese calligraphy. Thank you for reminding me that language can still build bridges between lonely people. Beneath the message, Kenji had included a small pressed cherry blossom preserved between two sheets of paper. Emily carefully placed both items beside the fountain pen on her bookshelf. Looking at them, she realized something unexpected. For the first time in years, she no longer felt entirely disconnected from the world she had left behind. Spring gradually turned into summer, and with each passing week, an unexpected friendship continued to grow. Although separated by age, culture, and circumstance, Emily Parker and Kenji Takahashi remained in contact long after his return to Tokyo. Sometimes they exchanged emails discussing literature. Other times, handwritten letters arrived carrying pressed flowers, poems, or reflections about life. Nearly every message moved effortlessly between English and Japanese, as naturally as old friends, continuing conversations interrupted only by distance. At the Grand Wellington, life remained largely unchanged. Emily continued serving guests, caring for her mother, and quietly setting aside the dreams she had once believed impossible to reclaim. Yet something inside her had shifted. The fountain pen resting on her bookshelf, the carefully preserved cherry blossom, and Kenji's letters reminded her that a forgotten part of herself still existed. One warm July afternoon, Emily returned home after finishing an early shift. She found her mother peacefully asleep in the living room while sunlight streamed through the apartment windows. Resting on the kitchen table was an overnight delivery envelope from Japan. Emily immediately recognized the elegant handwriting on the front. Smiling, she carefully opened it. Inside she discovered not a letter, but several documents accompanied by a brief handwritten note. Miss Parker, there are opportunities in life that should not remain abandoned forever. Please forgive an old businessman for interfering. Confused, Emily examined the documents. Within seconds, her hands began trembling. The papers came from Columbia University. More specifically, they came from the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures. Emily stared in disbelief. The university had reopened her doctoral file. Even more astonishing, she had been invited to re-enter the doctoral program beginning that autumn. Tuition, research expenses, and academic materials would be fully funded through a newly established international scholarship supporting intercultural communication studies. Emily sank slowly into a chair. For several moments, she could not breathe. She had left Columbia nearly 7 years earlier. She had never completed her dissertation. She had never even considered returning. Life, caregiving responsibilities, and financial realities had long ago convinced her that chapter had ended forever. At the bottom of the scholarship letter appeared the name of the benefactor. The Takahashi Foundation for Cultural Understanding. Tears immediately filled Emily's eyes. That evening, despite the 13-hour time difference, she called Tokyo. Kenji answered almost immediately. "Good morning, Miss Parker," he said warmly, as though he had been expecting her call. Emily struggled to speak. "You did this." There was a brief silence. "I simply opened a door," Kenji replied gently. "Walking through it remains your decision." Emily wiped tears from her eyes. "I cannot accept something this generous." Kenji's voice remained calm. "Why?" Emily hesitated. "Because I have not earned it." Kenji laughed softly. Miss Parker, the woman who transformed an impossible business negotiation, sacrificed her academic career for family, and still treats every stranger with dignity, has certainly earned an opportunity. Emily remained silent. "Years ago," Kenji continued, "someone invested in my education when my family could not afford it. That generosity changed my life." His voice softened. "Allow me the privilege of continuing that tradition." For several moments, neither spoke. Finally, Emily whispered, "Thank you." Kenji responded quietly in Japanese. "Arigato wa watashi no kotoba desu." Thank you is my phrase to say. When autumn arrived, Emily walked once again through Columbia University's campus carrying books beneath golden leaves drifting across familiar pathways. Everything looked both wonderfully familiar and completely new. She remained a waitress. She remained a caregiver. But she had also become something else again. A scholar. Standing outside the university library on her first day back, Emily looked toward the Manhattan skyline and smiled. Sometimes, she realized, the dreams we believe we have lost are merely waiting patiently for someone to remind us that they still belong to us. Nearly 18 months later, winter returned to New York City. Snow once again drifted softly across Manhattan, covering sidewalks and rooftops in white. Yet for Emily Parker, life looked profoundly different from the evening she had first served tea to a lonely stranger inside the Grand Wellington. During the day, Emily completed the final stages of her doctoral dissertation at Columbia University. In the evenings, she still worked several shifts each week at the restaurant, partly out of necessity, but mostly because she genuinely loved the people. Her mother's condition had gradually worsened, yet with additional support and flexible academic arrangements, Emily was able to remain present for both her family and her studies. One December afternoon, while organizing research materials inside the university library, Emily received an unexpected email. The subject line simply read, International Cultural Leadership Symposium. Curious, she opened it immediately. Emily had been selected to deliver the keynote address at one of the country's most prestigious conferences on intercultural communication. Scholars, diplomats, educators, and business leaders from more than 30 nations would attend. The event would take place in New York only 3 weeks later. On the evening of the symposium, the grand ballroom at Lincoln Center shimmered beneath elegant chandeliers. Distinguished guests filled the room. Conversations flowing in dozens of languages. Emily stood quietly backstage adjusting the sleeve of her navy dress, feeling surprisingly nervous. Professor Parker. The familiar voice immediately made her smile. Turning, she found Kenji Takahashi standing nearby. Although they had remained close friends throughout the previous year, seeing him there still felt special. "You came all the way from Tokyo," Emily said warmly. Kenji smiled. "I would not miss this evening." He paused. "Besides, I wish to hear the speech of the woman who rescued an international business negotiation." Emily laughed softly. Moments later, she walked onto the stage. The applause gradually faded as she approached the podium. Looking across the audience, she saw diplomats, university presidents, corporate executives, and researchers. Then she saw Kenji sitting quietly near the front row, his expression calm and encouraging. Emily began speaking. She spoke about language not as vocabulary or grammar, but as empathy. She spoke about cultural understanding, dignity, and the invisible loneliness people often carry. Then, near the end of her address, she shared a story. "Several years ago," she said softly, "I met a traveler who was surrounded by people and yet profoundly alone. Many saw only an accent. Some saw inconvenience. Very few saw the person." The ballroom grew silent. That evening reminded me that language is not merely about speaking. It is about seeing another human being and saying, in whatever words we possess, "You belong here." Complete silence filled the room. Several guests wiped tears from their eyes. When Emily finished, the audience rose in a standing ovation. Afterward, during the reception, scholars and business leaders gathered around her, eager to continue the conversation. Yet amid the celebration, Emily quietly stepped onto an outdoor terrace overlooking the snowy city skyline. A few moments later, Kenji joined her. For a while, they simply watched snow fall over Manhattan. Finally, Kenji spoke softly. "Do you remember our first meeting?" Emily smiled. "Very clearly." Kenji laughed gently. "So do I." He looked toward the city lights. "That evening, I believed I had lost an important business opportunity." He turned toward Emily. "Instead, I gained something infinitely more valuable." Emily looked at him curiously. Kenji smiled. "A friend. A reminder that kindness still exists. And proof that extraordinary people often wear very ordinary uniforms." Snow continued falling quietly around them. 18 months earlier, no one inside the Grand Wellington had respected the quiet Japanese businessman sitting alone at a table. They had judged him before hearing his story. Yet it had taken only one waitress speaking a familiar language to remind everyone of a simple truth. The quiet ones are never truly ordinary.